Thanks for joining me for the Outlaw Pulpit here live, and I am doing my podcast from here on out live, as many as I can anyways, so that I can get some good input from everybody that's watching. And again, feel free to comment, let me know where you're from and all of that stuff if you have questions pertaining to this podcast. This is really going to be no different than what I normally post on Wednesday mornings, but or rather Tuesday mornings. I've switched from Wednesdays to Tuesdays, except I'm doing it live. And so that'll give us a chance to interact a little bit, and then I'll post this and archive it into the Sanctuary YouTube stream, Facebook stream, all that stuff that streams. So I'm in a series right now called 16 Things I've Learned Over the Past 16 Years as a Pastor. I do pastor a church right here in Waupaca, Wisconsin, and it's been a pretty good thing. It's really been a nice time, and I've really enjoyed doing this. And so I thought, I'll share some thoughts of things I've learned over the past 16 years, because last month marked 16 years as a pastor of a church. Now I've been a youth pastor even more than that, 8 or 9, actually 9 years before I was a pastor of a church. I was also the youth pastor. So had a lot of experience there, but I've gone over a few things, topics I've discussed in the past, like God always provides. That was my number one point, that God always provides in regards to the church. And my point number two was that mistakes are going to be made. In fact, they should be expected. And talked about how pastors make mistakes in things they say, the programming of a church, all of that sort of stuff. And then I said, went right along with that, number three, wrong things will be said. And those are to be expected as well. If you've been at a job for 16 years, you've made a mistake. You've probably made a couple mistakes, and it's no different than for pastors as well. And so with pastors being part of a church, mistakes will be made and wrong things will be said as well. Number four, I think that I mentioned, was that churches need to stop comparing. In a nutshell, the competition is not other churches, it's the world. Churches should never be in competition with each other, because everybody does things differently. Everybody has their own way of doing stuff. And so my point number five that I want to get to today is that I would urge people to understand. Now, this one might be even more specific to pastors, because a lot of these really can apply to anybody in any sort of business environment or job place environment. But this one is probably more specific to pastors, is that don't fall for many conferences. That'd be my point number five. Don't fall for many conferences. One of the biggest things to happen in 2020 due to the pandemic was the lack of church conferences. And so many of them really are nothing more than a sales pitch anyway, so it was a good thing. It was refreshing not to have so many church conferences going on, because a lot of these church conferences that are flagged as beneficial and all of this stuff are really more than a way to buy into what they're doing. You usually don't see conferences held by or hosted by smaller churches, and that's because quite honestly, people aren't as in love with small churches, even though, according to George Barna reports, that I think it's 60% or 70%, it might be higher, of churches in the United States, at least, represent probably about 100 people or less on any given Sunday. I fall into that demographic with the church I pastor here in Waupaca, Wisconsin, and there's a lot of other churches around the area as well that fall into that demographic as well. So, many conferences are good, but there's a danger that pastors can fall into, and that is bouncing around from conference to conference. So again, if you are joining me on the stream this morning on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitch, feel free to comment, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. But the problem that I see is that these conferences that pastors go to, they try to mimic them. They go there, see what's working for that church, and they try to buy into their program to grow your church quickly, and it's just really is, it's sad to see, really, because each church, number one, let's go scriptural. Jesus said, I will build my church. And when he said that, guess what? He meant it. He meant that he's going to build his church. And so when pastors go away to these conferences and come back saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and all of these things, then you start trying to copy what's going on. And there's a real danger to that. Let's talk revivals for a minute. When I was born and raised Assemblies of God, Pentecostal, okay? And in 1995, one of the biggest revivals broke out in Pensacola, Florida, called the Brownsville Revival. There were some really cool things that came from it, but there were a lot of quackery that happened as well. And honestly, I think the worship that came out of that church was refreshing. Lindell Cooley led the worship, and I thought it was just really good stuff, that music-wise that came out of there. But what you had a lot of churches heading down there to see and be a part of this revival, and they came back and tried to mimic that in their own church, and it ended up failing. It failed miserably, in fact, and that's because pastors need to get it through their heads that you cannot mimic what is going on in another church. Sure, you can go to these conferences and learn about graphics and websites and how to put the right amount of information out there, marketing, stuff like that, okay? If you're a church, you do that sort of thing. But the danger in coming back from one of those and trying to do what they're doing really ends up being it ends up being a hot mess, because they come back thinking they're going to mimic, for this instance, Brownsville Revival, and they end up not doing it at all. And why? Because God didn't intend that for their church. That was for that church down in Pensacola. And so I've learned the best policy for conferences is to be selective and take a lot of truths from them, but also take them with a grain of salt. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a lot of publications out there that advertise how to do church, 10 steps to grow your church. If you go, I recently saw one yesterday that says, take your church from 200 to 1,000. And, well, maybe there's some good things in there, but chances are there might not be so many good things coming from it. Here's the deal for you pastors out there. Or those of you that are part of a church in the lay leadership or paid staff, whatever, find out what God wants to do in your church body, okay? Find out what God wants to do in your own local church and see what you can do to help make that happen. Because God plants visions, he plants dreams, he plants ideas, he puts all those things in our head. But when we go away to conferences, and some pastors are chronic conference goers, they go literally from conference to conference to conference, really at that point not knowing what they believe or what they want to do, but they just enjoy the atmosphere of a conference. But a pastor should find out what they want to do, what God wants to do in their local church. It really becomes a terrible thing when we look at other churches, or when they go to conferences and say, wow, everything was big, everything was awesome, the graphics were on, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, they spent a lot of money putting this thing together. They put a lot of money into advertising, and they're charging you to be there. Usually now it's up in the hundreds for any conference that a pastor wants to go to. And so when a pastor goes away and sees this, and it's like a little euphoric bubble for a week, well, yeah, it is awesome. Do you really think they operate at that level, though, every Sunday, every time? Not really. There are mix-ups. Our worship leader took some time off in the last couple months, and one Sunday I showed a couple videos, and one of them was a song that I really enjoy from Hillsong. I'll just admit it. And I was watching the background screens as they were trying to keep that out. The lyrics were not matching the song that was being said. In other words, the sound guy was screwing up. And you see, for these church conferences, they bring in their A team, they bring in their A game, and they give you something that when you go home, chances are a lot of pastors want to replicate that, but you just cannot with limited staff, lack of knowledge in technology and all of these things. And so I would urge that number five of 16. Next week's going to be one that I'm going to really get a rant on, go on a rant with. But number 5, don't fall for conferences. There was a blog that I read quite a while ago regarding pastors that hop from conference to conference, and it's just not okay. If you have a pastor that you are under his ministry, and he goes to a lot of conferences, maybe put a bug in his ear and say, you know what, this is good that you go to conferences and everything, but what does God want our church to do? What is it that God wants us to be? One of the dangers that worship leaders fall in, and our church has been no different. I remember one Sunday when one of our worship people came back from a concert, and they said, wow, they have this, they have that, they have this lead singer. And I just instantly said, you know what, though? Radiant Fellowship has this person. I called them out by name and that person. And just as extraordinary to me than going away to something where, ooh, big names, all of that sort of stuff. So, well, anyways, that is my rant for the day on the Outlaw Pulpit. And certainly if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, outlawpulpit@gmail.com, and I will address them right here next week on this broadcast. So I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye-bye.